Well, hello to Gospel Conversations again, and welcome to our second of the Ilaria Ramelli tapes. In the first tape, she talked about a big picture summary of what apokatastasis means and meant particularly for the Church Fathers. Now, in this talk, Robin asks her about the book that she has written. As you probably know, and I mentioned in my introduction, she wrote a game-changing, massive book on apokatastasis, which was 900 pages long. Robin persuaded her to do an abridged version. That's not just abridged, but actually much simpler, much better indexed. I mean, that first large book, which I've got, is really appallingly indexed. But this one is really accessible, and I'd recommend it highly to anyone who wants to understand more of the historical theology, the developing idea of apokatastasis through the centuries. Particularly, she's taking the epoch from the writing of the New Testament through to the Middle Ages. That's what she covers. So that's this talk, but there's more to it than just that. This, by the way, is the book. It's called A Larger Hope. I wanted to say a couple of things in introduction. The first is that clearly what is happening around the world is a growing openness to the doctrine that God will redeem all. And I think that's nowhere better illustrated than in the foreword to her book, which is by one of the world's eminent evangelical biblical scholars, Richard Bauckham. He was then I think he's retired now, but the professor of New Testament studies at the University of St Andrews. And you can read many books, famous books in Christian circles by Richard Bauckham. We did try to get him to come out for Gospel Conversations, but he's retired now and doesn't want to fly, so we might still interview him. A very famous book, which I've got up there, is called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And his argument around it's a literary historical argument that the Gospels were composed primarily through eyewitness accounts, and it's a very detailed literary study. So when somebody like him agrees to write the introduction to a book on universal salvation, that's a sign of the times. I'll read a couple of excerpts from his foreword. This is what he says. The extent to which a belief in universal salvation was held and taught in the early centuries of the Christian church has often been underestimated. As Professor Ramelli shows, this belief didn't originate with just Origen, but most of those who subsequently held to it were influenced by Origen and the particular shape that he gave to this hope of the final restoration of all God's rational creatures. Professor Ramelli shows this hope, cannot be dismissed as no more than an intrusion into the Christian tradition from Platonic philosophy. Now, that's a common criticism. These theologians rooted their teaching in exegesis of Scripture and embraced a Christocentric vision of the universe and God's purpose for it. He's really creeping up onto an endorsement with those words, but at the very least, he's saying what I believe we all need to say. This cannot be called a heresy. It must be a topic for conversation. That is what I would trenchantly argue in any Christian discourse. I wouldn't trenchantly argue people believe in it or not. That's actually, it's more the meta issue. This needs to be put back on the table of Christian discussion, and Bauckham is saying that. He's really got great admiration for her. He said she's thoroughly acquainted with all of the texts and the relevant secondary literature. And he goes on to talk specifically about the book and says a very valuable feature is the extensive quotations from all the writers in question, given in her own translations. And she provides for us in each case a full profile of the various factors. So in other words, it takes us into the history and the context of why writers thought that the way they thought. And he finishes his foreword with these words: "At a time when the popularity of belief in universal salvation seems to be increasing, this book will be an important resource, both for learning about the form the belief actually took in the early church and for engaging with the arguments of the key theologians who taught it." That, I think, is a very balanced and I think sign of the times forward. So just quickly, what she'll cover in this talk is more than just a summary of the book. Robin asks her, what's the central thesis of the book? Is it merely just descriptive history? And she said, well, not really. She's looking at these great authors and she has a threefold thesis that she'll develop. Firstly, they were thoroughly biblical. And this is really important, that these people were always deeply grappling with Scripture. And secondly, very importantly, they were Christocentric in all of their thinking. They viewed universal salvation through the lens of a what you can only call a vastly scoped picture of the incarnation. And thirdly, she said it had philosophical underpinnings. They were invariably people who engaged with the big questions of life, invariably were philosophically very literate. So that's how she opens up. She does then go on to a fairly extensive section on Origen. Of course, Origen has no one, I think, in Christian history has had more of a trash job done on their reputation than Origen. It's an absolute indictment of Christian culture, the way Origen is treated. And now, of course, there's a resurgence of his credibility, which I think probably began with Hans von Balthasar. But it's absolutely extraordinary. I mean, I think Michael McClimmon's book, The Devil's Redemption, is blameworthy in that respect. He's hammering Origen the whole time. I mean, we live comfortable lives. Origen did not. So he was martyred as an old man. So she talks about Origen, and of Origen she has this extraordinary statement, which is that without Origen, the patristics would fall. In other words, he was the foundation of the patristic thinking. To understand that, I like calling Origen the Aristotle of Christianity. Now, if you read philosophy, it's all under the shadow of Aristotle, including people who are disagreeing with Aristotle. And their disagreement is a kind of admiration. He created such a huge intellectual landscape, Aristotle did, that landscape then enabled people to discuss things. I think Bacon's great statement, the truth proceeds more readily from error than from confusion. And true to say that Christian theology prior to Origen was, there wasn't such a thing. He, like Aristotle, he built it into a system. Now, if you take such a vast task, you are going to obviously say things that are later challenged, probably quite rightly, and Origen expected that. She talks about his sheer brilliance. He was an Aristotelian giant, but in character, he was humble and very a servant of the church and a great teacher. Just whilst on Origen, another book which shows the recovery of his reputation is this very important book. If any of you ever wonder how the New Testament arose, the man to read about is Bruce Metzger, Metzger, an evangelical scholar who wrote a book called The Canon of the New Testament, its origin, development, and significance. Now, in that book, he discusses Origen's role in the development of the canon. So he's not looking at Origen through the lens of universal salvation, but his admiration for Origen is absolutely vast. Origen's output, intellectual capability, brilliance as a teacher is extraordinary. And even in his own day, it was clear he suffered the fate of geniuses, which is jealousy from peers, including from the man who was his original mentor. He just outshone them, and when you outshine people, people are going to have daggers out for you. But this is what Metzger says of Origen. Origen was a biblical scholar par excellence. His epoch-making work of textual studies of the Old Testament is said to have commented upon nearly all the books of the Bible, and this 3 times. So he wrote vastly on the Bible and vastly on his vision of salvation that the Bible revealed. So she talks about Origen, and with that moves to a conclusion, her hope for the book, her rhetorical hope that it will really educate people. And she does conclude the book with a response to McClimmon's criticism. And I think the way she does that is very commendable. She's very balanced. She says, well, here's what I like about Michael's work, and here's what I don't like. And it's very balanced, but it's a complete refutation. So enjoy this 10-minute talk from Ilaria.
Okay.
Okay, so you've written a book.
Yes.
In one sentence, what's it about?
Oh, no, I hope it will be appreciated. It will be useful. It will be helpful to readers. It is, well, not just, of course, a kind of more popular and shorter version of the huge book on apocatastasis with Brill, so from the New Testament to Origen. But it's not just, a shortening, a simplification, but also it goes on also in the time. It has some new chapters, some aspects, for instance, on annihilationism that was lacking there. And also it goes on with time, so we go until Julian of Norwich, who is much later. We go until Meister Eckhart. We have other important authors that were not treated in the first one, and hopefully it's also useful to people who are maybe not a scholar by profession, but other Christians or other interesting people, but it's still very rigorous. It's all founded in all the texts, but it's all translated, so there's almost nothing from in the original languages translated, hopefully very carefully. And I'm very happy also that there are endorsements by great scholars, Father Andrew Louth, there's Mark Edwards, there's Francis Young. I saw so I'm very, very happy. And also there are others also. I'm very, very happy. David Bentley Hart also. Yes.
And it has pictures.
Yeah.
It has pictures.
Oh yes. No, that's good. Yes, of course. The other hadn't. This is very, very beautiful. Also, and also the picture of Origen. Of course, we couldn't mention. And it's very important. It's very important.
So,
by Eileen, it's beautiful. Absolutely.
In a nutshell.
Yes.
Or one sentence. What is your thesis?
My thesis,
Do you have a thesis?
Well, it's actually is the same of all my work in historical theology, that then will go on with the rejection of apocatastasis, and then will go on also with the implication between philosophical apocatastasis and patristic apocatastasis. So there are 3 big research, but concentrating on patristic apocatastasis, mainly the thesis is that it has very strong biblical roots. Then it has also philosophical underpinnings and support, but it is mainly biblical, and mainly it's really Christological. In all the main teachers, who are, by the way, most of them are saints, not all, but most of them are saints, they try to show really that the main work of apocatastasis is founded in the goodness, as I mentioned earlier, in the goodness of God, so the agatotes theou understood really in a metaphysical way, and also in the work of Christ, so in the work of incarnation, which is absolutely important. For Origen, it's already the incarnation that brings about apocatastasis, and also in the big sacrifice of Christ. And Origen has a wonderful sentence saying that this sacrifice was enough to set right and so to make the apocatastasis of all rational creatures in all ages, in all times, and in all places. So just one sacrifice once and for all, once and for all. So this is ephapax is the word. It's a word borrowed from the Epistle to the Hebrews. So this is mainly what they think.
Thank you. You mentioned Origen. You love Origen. Why should we love Origen?
So Origen is a very fascinating figure. Well, for me, it's very fascinating also because he was extremely intelligent and he was very learned and very intelligent. And just for that, he was also very much hated and very much envied. And so he's also a victim, and he says that. But he was already aware, and then we see that in the aftermath, of course, of his reception. But he was also very much loved, and he exerted a huge, influence in many ways, in exegetical ways, in theological ways, in many. I would say that without Origen, patristics would fall. Without Origen, there's almost no patristics, actually, and so many people depend on him in many ways. But Origen was also a humble person, and for me, Origen is a saint. I mean, he was an ascetic. He was one who devoted all of his life to teaching, to meditating Scripture, to understanding Scripture, to try to convey to other people his findings, to try to convert people, and to try to support the goodness of Christianity in a time when it was needed, and to find the philosophical basis for Christianity, and to structure Christianity as a great philosophy, and so religion and philosophy really together, religion, philosophical theology really. And since I am an adept of philosophical theology and philosophy of religion, I think he's one of the most illustrious and luminous figures in this way. But also really as a saint, as an ascetic, as a very intelligent person, and a person who used his intelligence in the service of the church. And actually, as he himself say, I am an ecclesiasticus vir, so this is in the translation, of course, I am an ecclesiastikos, I am a man of the church. And as Pamphilus, his great apologist, said, he was a man of the church, a man of the church who lived all his life in the church, and actually he gave his life for the church in the end, because he was tortured and then he died for that. So surely he was a confessor. We can say he was a martyr or a confessor. And actually Father Henri Crozelle wanted to initiate an action for the recognition of the of the holiness of Origen, and we should still do something like that, actually.
So, in one sentence to finish, why should we buy this book?
The book well, it's not only on Origen, of course, but very generally is, to learn something, especially also on the part of not extremely specialistic people, so for all Christians or all interested people or learned people, to learn something about this very important doctrine that runs through through the history of the church until now. Then, of course, we have von Balthasar, and we have many people until now among the Catholics, but also among the Orthodox, clearly, and among Protestant, among everyone in Christianity, and hopefully even people interested out of Christianity. Maybe they may be attracted to Christianity also by means of this doctrine. But again, not as a means of leniency, not because it teaches leniency, it teaches to behave badly because then you will be saved. This is not absolutely the idea, because all of the patristic supporters insisted that every coin will be taken into account, so every sin will be taken into account, so there will be punishment, or better, it's a purification, but still purification will be very painful. So this is not a doctrine that teaches people to behave lightly or badly, but it's a doctrine that reveals the glory of God.
Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed Ilaria's talk. There'll be more to come, but as I listened to the talk, I thought it would be a good idea to attach a more recent talk from Robin Parry, where he talks about his side of the double book that they created. That is, the people in the last 100 and 200 years who have worked their way through to a belief in cosmic redemption or universal salvation. And it's a most illuminating talk because he talks about the different avenues by which people came, generally theologians, pastors, very biblically literate evangelical Christians, by which people came to this dawning belief that in the end God will save all. So we will post a link to that talk up shortly, and I think it'll splice in very nicely with Ilaria's talk, since Ilaria's book, A Larger Hope, was on the first, let's say 1,000 years, tracing the development of this doctrine, and Robin's is on the last, let's say, 250 years. I think they go together very powerfully.